So I want to really talk about making sustainable business happen at scale across value chains. If we look at the contents for a second, I'm going to give a very brief introduction to 2 degrees, really just to set our credentials for addressing you like this. And then I want to touch upon what I call the collaboration imperative. Why is it in the 21st century collaboration is something extraordinary and different and powerful and essential in a way it wasn't in the 20th century? Why is it also so difficult to collaborate effectively across supply chains? And then I want to talk actually about how that challenge has come back to 2 degrees and how we're doing now there's a remarkable initiative that we're launching currently with support of people like Unilever and the Co-op, NPower and others, that I want to explain and share with you and what that is and why I think it's so important. So just first of all, very quickly, so 2 degrees has unrivaled experience in running very large-scale supply chain collaborations. We are the leading provider of collaboration platforms and services for sustainable business. And a client of ours once described what we do. He said, it's a bit like having a huge room into which I can invite all our suppliers 365 days of the year. And it's not the usual people who we're inviting in. It's the operational managers, the waste, the water managers, the energy managers, the factory managers, the chief engineers, the people that we as a customer, he was saying, don't normally get to talk to. And we're able to bring them into this room and organize them and encourage them to self-organize to share the challenges that they're facing around sustainability and working with us and work together to resolve them, sharing best practice and insights and experience and know-how, person to person. But of course done largely virtually. And we've been doing that now for about 6-7 years. And you can see on the left-hand side the kinds of brands that we've been running programs with across supply chains. I suppose in food and drink, the best-known program that we run is, of course, the ASDA Sustain and Save Exchange. And we estimate now that over a 5-year period, that program is generating about 100 million euros of cost savings in wastewater and energy in that supply base, directly enabled and accelerated as a result of one wastewater engineer, factory manager, sustainability manager asking for help on issues from voltage optimization to reed beds we just saw from Glenisk. I saw a conversation about that very recently, or HVAC, or whatever the issue, normally very technical things, and getting on average 7 supplier responses offering help. Huge interconnected collaboration in those supply chains. Now, let's talk a little bit about the collaboration imperative, and really let's put a marker into the ground about why this is so important. Because we talk in business, and particularly in sustainability circles, we talk a really good game for collaboration, but the reality is we are absolutely at the very beginning of it. And I'd say that for 2 degrees as well as anybody else in this room. Collaboration in the 21st century is different. And in fact, I can't imagine a business that can survive and thrive over any length of time as we go forward from today if they do not collaborate excellently. And that might be a bold statement to make, but let me see if I can explain why that is the case. What makes collaboration in the 21st century different is what makes the 21st century different. And that means we have to come back to this notion of the Anthropocene and that huge growth that we have, not just in global populations, but in the consuming middle class, going from something around 2 billion in 2010 to about 5 billion in 2030. So that's more than doubling in the consumption of that class. And that creates enormous opportunities for businesses, particularly obviously in the food industry, but huge challenges and stresses. And there are 4 reasons why in responding to those opportunities and challenges that collaboration is so key. Well, firstly, it's because, of course, many of those sustainability challenges are themselves kind of the product, if you like, of the tragedy of the commons. The issues that we're dealing with, water, air into which we can put CO2, these are not assets that any one organization or country owns. They are held in common, and so therefore we can only resolve how we use them collaboratively. Secondly, most of the supply chains that we have a linear model that we know of, don't they? We take something out of the ground, or we grow it, or we dig it up, we process it, we manufacture it, we package it, we distribute it, we use it, we throw a large amount of it away at the other end, and we start again. For us to be able to survive and thrive, we have to change the systems at the heart of our supply chains and value chains, and that can only be done with very widespread collaboration. So system change requires collaboration. Thirdly, of course, in our efforts to reduce our costs, to find competitive advantage over the last 20 years, we have got excellent at offshoring and outsourcing. And the result is that we have very large, extended, fragile, opaque supply chains. Supply chains over which we have little control in many cases. And the only way that we can get those supply chains to work in our favor is through collaboration. And lastly, of course, and related to that point, is reputation. That our reputations as brands and businesses are now very often dependent upon the weakest link in those fragile supply chains. And we cannot tell those suppliers what to do. We can only work with them. Now, all of that has meant that, of course, collaboration and sustainable supply chains have got to the boardroom, particularly in the last couple of years, in the way we've never seen it before. And I wanted to share with you some slides courtesy of McKinsey. If you haven't seen their latest sustainable supply chain, starting at the source of it, white paper, then I suggest you do read it. It's very, very, very interesting. It starts off with this particular slide, which basically says that for public companies in the FMCG market, and that includes food for them, 51% of the stock price, the share value of the companies, are predicated on future cash flows and growth, which are fundamentally affected by sustainability. Now, they talk here about chipping away at the value of that future cash flow growth. In fact, I think in many cases this is a huge understatement. Let's just take an example that I think Denise referenced a second ago. So, I don't know if you've heard Barry Parkin speaking about cocoa in Ghana. Barry Parkin is the Chief Sustainability Officer for Mars. Okay, he asks two questions that turns this from chipping away to absolutely taking chunks out of. So first question is, what's the average life expectancy of a Ghanaian cocoa farmer? Any answers? Hands up? A quick guess. Somebody have a guess. Shout it out. 60. 50. It's 60. Very good. Thank you for joining in. Guess what the average age of a Ghanaian farmer is? 52. Yeah, down here on my right. 52. That means we have how many years of cocoa growth? Cocoa production. 8 years. So when you start looking at that kind of stuff, it's not chipping away at, it's absolutely tearing it to pieces. Second slide from our friends at McKinsey to share. So this shows 5 points on a graph. Now the first one, A, shows the growth they see in the market for fast-moving consumer goods, including food and drink, because of that growth in the consuming middle classes. So you're going up there from the bottom right, about 15 trillion rather, to close up to 60 trillion. Huge, massive growth over the 45 years, well, 35 years on that scale. But then, if it's to be done sustainably, they're postulating that the reduction in carbon emissions as an indicator of what sustainable measurement and progress would look like has to come right down. You can see it coming down from points B to C. The interesting thing is, what does that mean in terms of carbon intensity? And that's what you see in the last graph. It's a 92% drop in carbon intensity for the food and drink industry and the FMCG industry as a whole. 92% cut in intensity. It's just absolutely massive. And when you ask yourself, coming back to the subject of today, where is all of that sitting? It is, of course, sitting in the supply chain. Whether that's carbon we're looking at, or whether that's other natural capital resources that we're consuming. And that means we have to work with our supply chains at a level of intensity and at a scale that we're not close to. We're not close to it yet. We're really not. So why is it so difficult to get there? Well, I think there are lots of reasons. And here are just some of the kind of challenges when we talk to people about collaborating with their suppliers that they raise. So where do we start? Denise touched upon how do we identify what's material risk in our supply chain, and so therefore where we're going to focus our efforts. How on earth do we do it at the scale that's required? If you're Unilever, you have 80,000 odd suppliers and you're tier 1, let alone going down to tier 2 and 3. Even for smaller organizations, as you drop below the tiers, the numbers get quite large. Often, of course, you're not in control of what's going on. We know of brands that we work with who thought they were completely clear of the problems at Rana Plaza, only to find out that the people they were contracting had contracted somebody else, who'd contracted somebody else and produced a zip in the Rana Plaza building. So actually even knowing whether you're collaborating with the right people is particularly difficult. Understanding and the need for education. Our suppliers very often don't understand why this is so important to us. They don't understand why it's so important to the board of the public companies that ultimately their products are probably reaching and serving. So there's a lot of work doing just in explaining that. And sometimes, and in many cases, you may only be a small percentage of your suppliers' turnover. They're not going to change what they do for you if 90% of their other customers don't seem to want it. A great example from M&S, when Richard Gillies was director of Plan A, talking about going to a cotton mill in India and asking for organic cotton. And the chap smiled at him, put his arm around Richard's shoulder, led him into the warehouse, huge aircraft hangar of a warehouse. And he said, you see those 3 spools in the corner there? Those are yours. And the rest of the room, it was a bit like sort of, just full, hundreds if not thousands of these spools going down. He said, I can't possibly strip out my production lines, clean it all off, reorganize it in order that your 3 can be certified as organic. So we have challenges of trying to do it alone that make it very difficult. And of course, the suppliers that we work with don't have the capacity to change, do they? They don't have the internal resources. They're often very small organizations. And lastly, I think for customer organizations, very often our culture is completely wrong. Our culture internally, just how the sustainability team perhaps, or the purchasing team, how that dynamic interaction takes place internally makes this very difficult. But certainly the relationship between buyers and sellers, customers and suppliers is often very wrong. So what is it? What's the response that we see that happens? So classically, I think customers start off by trying to improve their communications. This is a good thing to do. M&S's supplier exchange is a great example. Let's make sure we're communicating better. So sort of step 1. Step 2 is that we seek transparency. We live by the adage that you can't manage what you can't measure. So we say, okay, we must measure. Now sometimes there are organizations out there, like the Sustainability Consortium and WWF and CDP, who can help us understand where the hotspots in our industry are generically, and so therefore that can give us indications of where we should be looking. But then the next step, obviously, is to buy the software. Let's go to EcoDesk or EcoVadis or Credit 360. Let's start to measure in order to manage. And then lastly, we perhaps make a few small interventions. We run some small-scale engagements. These are all good things to do. We create some demonstration projects. We bring in a Kaizen team, a lean manufacturing team. We send them in to have a look at particular sites that are critical in our supply chain, and we work with them. And then we get stuck. And why do we get stuck? We get stuck, and this is a story that brings it about, because none of those things are quite enough on their own. So there's a manufacturer, I won't mention their name, who went through the process I've just described, and they decided to audit their suppliers. And only 3% on the initial audit, when they were just setting a baseline, passed the minimal standard that they required. So, at the end of every audit, they sent the suppliers, every one of them, a sort of document saying what they must do in order to comply and why it was so important they complied. And they went and audited them a year later. They said, we're coming around in a year, we expect you to improve. Fabulous. 85% of them passed. They were delighted. Then it just happened that they started hearing stuff from the market, so they thought they'd do some spot checks. 5% passed. The stick and measurement, and not saying it's absolutely essential we measure, the software is very important, but it is not sufficient. Necessary, but not sufficient to drive change. In fact, we've faced the whole time a trade-off between impact and scale. Traditional comms have great reach. We can talk to most or very large numbers of our suppliers in this way. Software auditing and reporting can have great reach. Slightly less if you're asking them to pay, and because there's effort and there's duplication of effort and they're doing it for other customers, but you can still get very large reach. But the impact of these things, as I've just demonstrated, are low. Interventions, we can make a huge difference to one factory. We can make a massive difference to one supplier, but it's absolutely not scalable because it costs so much. So we've got this trade-off that's causing us problems. Now, some data platforms are coming along which are a partial response. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Ready. This is the work that McKinsey are doing with Walmart and their supply chain in China in particular. So there's some process being made there, but it's only partial. And it's only partial because data and sharing data only takes us part of the way. It tells us the what. It's that what's down in the bottom right there, what we have to do. It doesn't help us top left on how we have to do it. We need to interact with people to know how to do it. And when we do, we make progress. So Ready has its limitations. As Professor Steve Evans at Cambridge has put it very recently, we don't need libraries of answers. What we need is access to common sense at scale. We need to leverage the power of everyone working on continuous improvement. That means sharing as individuals our knowledge and our insight. If we get that right, we're up in that top right-hand corner. We can engage large numbers of people, and we can do it with great impact in that supply chain. And that means combining peer-to-peer collaboration, combining, if I go back one, combining data and getting the scale right at the same time. So it's a big challenge for 2 degrees here. We thought this is what we were trying to do. If we can put our interventions up there again, if you look at program cost, very expensive and low scale, we thought we were top right, or rather bottom right, but we weren't. Our feedback was that actually we're very effective but very expensive. And actually there was much more scale and therefore much more value that needed to be created. As a result of which, we're launching, with the help of Unilever, the Co-op, Npower and WRAP and a whole bunch of other companies, a thing called the Sustainable Manufacturing Platform. And it's focusing first and foremost on food and drink and FMCG. And it changes the dynamics. It massively reduces the cost of these programs by doing them together on one platform. And it massively increases the scale and the value of the collaboration by bringing together thousands of organizations, tens of thousands, I think, in the end, to share best practice and knowledge and insight. Very quickly, to take you through some of the elements to it, it's about improving suppliers' understanding of their customers' priorities and why it really matters. It's about driving continuous improvement at a site level, and it's about making breakthroughs where necessary to source innovations, collectively sharing risk and cost. If you look at a schematic of it, it really has 3 elements to it. It has what we call the supplier engagement channels, which can be private, so they're your space for the Co-op or for Unilever, where they can talk with their suppliers in detail about their issues. But it also includes open spaces where suppliers from different supply chains can work together, water, waste, and energy as examples. So you can maximize the amount of knowledge and the cross-referencing and the learning from different industries and different sectors. It also has a thing called a continuous improvement tool, which we've been building with, some of you might know Dave Clark, who is at PepsiCo, which is a diagnostic and site-by-site improvement, gives you kind of, I'll come to it in a second, tool, and then there is an area where we collaborate to source innovations. So very quickly, because I know I'm going to be running out of time on this, these are the engagement channels. They're very similar to the programs that we run for the likes of Glaxo and Asda and others at the moment. And you can see what they're doing. They're helping customers engage with their suppliers much better. Amongst them, particularly with the help of Unilever, we're able to work cross-supply chain on some common themes around wastewater and energy. And I'm very grateful for Unilever, who are providing all their knowledge around zero waste to landfill in their factories, which I think is going to be a huge asset that they're sharing. The programs, those areas of the programs look a bit like what some of you will know as the Asda Sustain and Save Exchange. The continuous improvement tool is very different. It is a tool. It's got a site-level diagnostic. It generates a customized to-do list and links, critically, that to-do list to a set of tailored resources directly relevant to you that are peer-generated and validated. So they're from other people who've done things like this before in industries like yours. So I'll just give you some examples as you go. This is just an example of the personalist assessment of your site. And you can see up there on the left in yellow, air compressors is important to this particular person. There are 162 peer-validated resources on air compressors. This person is going to dive into those air compressors and in detail look at the various things that they can do, installing compressors at intakes. If I can put my glasses on, I can read this a bit better perhaps. Reduce the pressure of compressed air to the minimum required and so forth. So there's various things they can do. You can see data about payback periods, what sort of savings you're going to be making on it. So it's data informed. But critically, it then leads you through to resources where you can talk directly to people like you who are already doing this or have done this. And so you can see these kinds of engagements here. So you can meet up with people like yourself who've done it or are doing it. And all the evidence we have, it's this combination of data and that interpersonal interaction around know-how that makes a difference. This is the final bit where we are looking to source innovations collaboratively, where you get common problems and we need to break through. Thin film plastics, example, we're doing a big program around sharing trucks and distribution in Northern Europe at the moment, funded by Horizon 2020. It's an example of this kind of activity. Just giving you an idea, previous programs, like the ASA program, were closer to £250,000. So being able to do this collectively in large numbers massively reduces the programs, both for the cost to the customer, which is that top one, bringing their supply chains on, or to individual suppliers, so you can bring all of your factories through that continuous improvement tool. The cost of the sharing and the learning is massively reduced when we do it together. We're looking for more partners to join, the fabulous ones we already have. We're talking to the likes of Mars and J&J and Nestle and others, and really having great conversations, but we'd love more to come and join us. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.